She thought she was saving a life. She had no idea she was walking into a death trap set by a woman who had perfected the art of revenge. What happens when a simple act of kindness leads to a deadly game where no one can be trusted? The clock is ticking and no one knows who will make it out alive. You'll be on the edge of your seat trying to figure out who's the real threat. Stay with me and by the end you'll wish you never asked. What's the worst that could happen? What you're about to hear isn't just about an affair gone wrong. This is about how love, lies, and hidden cameras can destroy 3 lives in the most brutal way imaginable. Imagine a secret so dark it could shatter everything you thought you knew about trust. The tension builds and with each twist, someone pays the ultimate price. But who's pulling the strings in this twisted web of deceit? Who will make the first move? And who will be left behind? Let's unravel the mystery together, and by the end, you'll wonder if you ever truly knew the people around you. Meet Maria Santos. Born on April 8, 1994 in Quezon City, Philippines. At just 28 years old, Maria is the eldest of 5 children, a role she's taken on with a quiet strength. In a home that's a far cry from the comforts most take for granted, Maria's world was shaped by struggle. Her father, Roberto, works long 16-hour days as a jeepney driver. His body weary from endless hours on Manila's unforgiving streets. Her mother, Elena, hustles daily, selling vegetables to make ends meet. Her hands always busy, her spirit unyielding. Their family, squeezed into a 1-bedroom shanty, has learned to survive against the odds, clinging to each other, to dreams of something better. But beneath the smile, the sacrifices, and the daily grind, there's a secret Maria carries with her. A secret that could change everything. One decision, one moment of weakness, and her world could come crashing down. Maria's path wasn't easy, but she was determined. She earned a scholarship to study nursing at the University of Sto. Tomas, the pride of her family. With every step, she rose above the challenges of her humble beginnings. She wasn't just a student. She was the top of her class. Always present, always focused, no excuses, no distractions. She worked part-time at a local clinic, juggling the pressure of exams with the responsibility of helping others. Her dedication was unmatched. Every sleepless night, every early morning was for one dream: to earn enough money in Canada to give her family the life they deserved. A proper house. A chance at something better. Maria's dream was simple but profound. A house for her family. A chance to change their fate. But the road ahead would test her in ways she could never have imagined. The pursuit of a better life is never as straightforward as it seems. Maria wasn't just brilliant. She was driven by something deeper than ambition. Every late night studying, every sacrifice was for the 5 people back home who depended on her. Her dreams were never just her own. They were a lifeline for her family, a promise to her mother, a hope for her younger siblings, a chance for her father to finally rest. She carried their weight on her shoulders, and it fueled her every step. As the plane soared into the sky, Maria left behind everything she had ever known. The bustling streets of Manila, the cramped room filled with memories. She was leaving to create something better. But in the back of her mind, there was always a question. What price would she have to pay for this dream? Would it be worth it? October 15, 2019. Maria's new chapter began with nothing more than a suitcase, her nursing credentials, and $200 in cash. A world of opportunity. awaited her, but it felt distant, almost unreachable. She moved into a shared basement apartment in Scarborough, squeezed in with 3 other nurses from different corners of the world, each one with their own dream, their own fight. Her new life was nothing like the picture she had painted. It was a fight for survival. Working double shifts at Toronto General Hospital, barely catching enough sleep to keep going. Each day felt like a battle. Exhaustion setting in. The loneliness of being so far from home creeping in. But Maria pushed on, knowing her family was counting on her. Every hour worked. Every drop of sweat was another step closer to the life they all dreamed of. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of a much darker chapter. Because in this city, where dreams are built and broken, some secrets, no matter how hard you work to bury them, will find their way to the surface. Meet David Morrison. At 42, he's the picture of success, a construction mogul who built his empire from the ground up. David is the face of luxury and wealth in the Greater Toronto area. His company, Morrison Development Group, is behind some of the most exclusive high-rise condos across the city. Each one a testament to his relentless drive. With a net worth of $50 million, a penthouse in Yorkville worth $8 million, a fleet of vintage cars, and a yacht moored on the calm waters of Lake Ontario. He's got it all, or so it seems. But there's a weakness in David's perfect world. A flaw he can't fix with money, status, or power. David Morrison could build empires, but he couldn't build a faithful heart. The very thing that could destroy everything he had, everything he worked for, was the thing he could never control, his own desires. While the world admires him, few know the true cost of his success. And as fate would have it, his most dangerous enemy won't come from the boardroom or the streets of Toronto. It will come from within, lurking, waiting to unravel his carefully constructed life. David's life is a pattern, a relentless cycle. First, it was the personal trainer in 2017, a woman who pushed him to new physical limits. But when the passion faded, so did her place in his life. Then came the marketing executive in 2018, a bright and ambitious woman who helped expand his brand. She thought she was part of his future until she wasn't. And in 2019, it was the interior designer. She lasted just 6 months before she was replaced by someone new. His relationships came and went as fleeting as the next business deal. Always driven by his need to conquer, to possess. Each time he promised more. Each time they thought they had a future. But with every new person in his life, David's heart remained untouched. His loyalty to none. Behind the polished suits, the luxury cars, and the penthouse views, there was only one constant, the emptiness in his eyes. He could never love anyone the way he loved himself. David's pattern was simple. Love them, use them, then cast them aside when they no longer served his needs. And in his wake, only the destruction of trust and the inevitable cost of betrayal. February 2020. A simple procedure, they said, an emergency appendectomy at Mount Sinai Hospital. But what was meant to be routine soon spiraled into a nightmare. During the surgery, complications arose. The once stable operation turned into a frantic race to stabilize his body, as the delicate balance of his life hung by a thread. When David finally woke up, the world around him had changed. The complications from the surgery left him vulnerable, needing more care than he'd ever imagined. 6 weeks of intensive home care, his body fragile, his strength waning. And as the days dragged on, it Became clear this wasn't going to be easy. With his empire at risk, David's pride was shattered. The doctor's recommendation was simple but undeniable. A private nurse, someone who would be there round the clock to monitor his condition to make sure he made it through. But what David didn't know was that this nurse would become more than just a caretaker. She would be the one to hold his fate in her hands, whether he knew it or not. Meet Victoria Morrison. At 35, she's the epitome of beauty and grace. A former fashion model, Victoria married David at just 22, believing that love would flourish alongside the wealth she was promised. But 13 years later, the reality of her marriage was far from the picture-perfect fantasy she had imagined. Married for over a decade, Victoria had everything society deemed valuable: luxury, status, and a marriage to a man who could offer it all. But what she didn't have was the one thing she wanted most: a family. No children despite her longing. It was David's choice, a decision that over time grew into a silent chasm between them. Victoria had perfected the art of beautiful endurance. Every public smile hid private devastation. The facade she wore in public was unbreakable. Hostess of charity events, a respected member of hospital boards. But behind closed doors, her life was a quiet battle. The woman who appeared to have it all had lost herself along the way. She had become a masterpiece of appearances. But the cracks in the image were starting to show. And now, as David's life hung by a thread, Victoria would be forced to face the reality she had been running from. Whether she was ready or not, Victoria had always suspected. But it wasn't until she hired a private investigator that the truth came crashing down. David's pattern of affairs, hidden behind the closed doors of his luxury offices and boardrooms, was laid bare before her. The interior designer affair was the final blow. What had almost become a public scandal, a whisper across Toronto's elite circles, nearly destroyed everything they had built. The stories, the secrets, they were all out. They're waiting to surface. Victoria's world was built on one thing: social status. In Toronto's elite circles, appearances were everything. And with every new affair, every new lie, David was shattering the very thing that kept her tethered to this world. Her friends, once confidants, now pitted her, their whispered conversations full of judgment. The woman who had everything was losing it all. But this time, Victoria wasn't planning to endure. She wasn't going to sit in the shadows of her husband's betrayals any longer. No more pretending. No more smiles. This time, she was planning to end it all. Maria's first day at the penthouse felt like stepping into another world, a world where luxury and power were as commonplace as the air people breathed. She had no time to admire the glossy marble floors or the sweeping views of the city. She was here for one reason: to care for David Morrison, the man she had only heard about in passing, but now found herself tied to through the very job that would change everything. Victoria watched from across the room, her gaze sharp and unblinking. She had seen countless nurses come and go, each one easily replaceable. Their role just another cog in the machine of David's empire. But something about Maria stood out. Perhaps it was her poise, her professionalism, or the way she wasn't fazed by the luxury surrounding her. She hadn't been impressed by wealth, and that Victoria knew was dangerous. Maria wasn't here to play games. She was here to do what she was trained for: to heal, to help, and to get out. She noticed Victoria's watchful eyes, but didn't acknowledge them. There was no time for distractions. And while Victoria's assessment of her was still unfolding, Maria had already made a decision. She wasn't going to get tangled in this dangerous world. She had a job to do. And that was all that mattered. But in a house where secrets are more common than honesty, Maria's presence would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. Every morning at 6 a.m., Maria arrived at the penthouse. Her footsteps echoing down the hallway as she prepared herself for another day in David's world. There was no room for error, no time for anything other than professionalism. Her first task was always the same. Check David's vitals. Each morning, she would assess his condition, administer his medications with meticulous care, and ensure that everything was on track. For Maria, this was just another shift, another day at work. But for David and Victoria, it was far more than that. David's charm had always been a weapon. He used it effortlessly on business, on women, on anyone who could give him what he wanted. But Maria wasn't like the others. She didn't fall for smooth words or flattery. She had seen it all, and she had a job to do. Maria maintained a careful distance, professionally polite, but emotionally detached. She was here to do a job and nothing more. Her presence was a reminder to David that his wealth and power meant nothing in this room. Here it was about healing, not manipulating. But David, ever persistent, failed to mask the frustration that came with his failed attempts at charm. He couldn't control her the way he had controlled so many others. Victoria's watchful eye never wavered. From the moment Maria stepped through the door, she had begun her own surveillance operation. Quietly, carefully, always in the background. She knew her husband, and she knew the power of a woman like Maria. Her instincts told her to be cautious, to monitor every move. If David's attention turned to the nurse in a way it hadn't before, Victoria would be ready. As the days passed, Maria continued her daily routine. Vitals checked, medications given, professional distance maintained. But behind every polite exchange, a quiet game of strategy was being played. David tried his best to draw Maria in. But it was Victoria in the shadows who had already begun making her moves. The stakes were rising slowly, but surely. Maria's life in Toronto was a quiet existence. Every day she worked tirelessly caring for David, earning just enough to send 80% of her salary back home to the Philippines. It was a sacrifice she made willingly, driven by the weight of her family's needs. Her youngest brother needed surgery. Her parents were aging and every penny sent home was one step closer to the life they all dreamed of. Yet, for all the love she shared with her family, she was profoundly isolated in this city. No friends, no social life, just the unending cycle of work and quiet, lonely nights. In Toronto, Maria had no one to turn to, no community to lean on. The isolation felt heavy, a constant reminder that her life here was temporary, a means to an end. Her family's hopes rested on her shoulders. And with each passing day, the pressure grew. But what Maria didn't realize was that her loneliness wasn't just a personal struggle. It was part of something far more dangerous. Because David Morrison, with all his wealth and power, had perfected a strategy that could break even the strongest of people. David Morrison didn't pursue women. He studied them. He learned their vulnerabilities. What made them tick? What drove them? Then with surgical precision, he exploited those vulnerabilities to get what he wanted. It wasn't about charm or passion for him. It was about control. Every word, every glance, every gesture was carefully calculated to pull them closer, to make them believe they were the only one who mattered. David knew how to manipulate those around him. How to make them feel special, wanted, needed. But it was never about love. It was about power. The power to control. To possess, to break someone down until they had nothing left but him. Maria was no different. She had all the signs of someone ripe for manipulation. Isolated, vulnerable, and desperate to succeed. To David, she wasn't a person to be cared for. She was a puzzle to be solved, a game to be won. And in this game, David always played to win. As the days passed, David began to soften his approach. No longer the brash manipulator, he shifted tactics slowly. Deliberately. At first, it was small talk during her medication rounds. He'd ask about her family, her life back home. In the Philippines. Casual questions, the kind that might seem innocent enough to someone who didn't know him. But David wasn't interested in the answers. He was building a connection one thread at a time. He remembered details from their past conversations. Small things. Things most would forget. The kind of details that made her feel seen, understood. It was a tactic, a careful strategy to make her trust him. He knew that people remembered the ones who made them feel special, who listened and cared about the little things. Then came the offer, an offer wrapped in kindness. A lifeline in the guise of generosity. David suggested that he could help with her brother's medical bills. The gesture seemed sincere, but Maria knew better. She politely declined, her voice calm but firm, the boundaries she had so carefully erected between them still intact. David respected her boundaries. At least outwardly. His respect wasn't about care. It was a calculated move. He knew better than to push too hard, too fast. He had learned that the slow burn was far more effective than force. He could wait, and as he watched Maria, he knew she was the one person who could break his carefully controlled world, and he wasn't about to let her slip away. In a game of patience and precision, David had only just begun. And Maria, unaware of his true intentions, remained unaware of the storm that was slowly, inevitably closing in around her. It was late one night during the quiet hours of her shift when everything changed. David's condition had been stable, but that night, something shifted. His breathing grew shallow, his chest tightening. The calm that usually surrounded him was replaced by panic. Something unfamiliar. Something dangerous, a panic attack. David had never experienced one like this. His body betrayed him, his mind spinning out of control as the fear of losing everything clawed at him. He wasn't the invincible man he had always thought he was. For the first time, David's walls came down and he was left exposed. Maria stayed with him. Her presence a grounding force. She talked him through the breathing exercises, her calm voice cutting through the chaos of his panic. Slowly, his breathing steadied, his frantic energy settling into a quiet rhythm. It wasn't just the medication or the medical equipment that helped him. It was Maria. She wasn't just his nurse in that moment. She was his lifeline. It was in this fragile moment between breath and heartbeat that Maria and David shared something real, something that neither of them had expected. For the first time, they spoke as people, not roles. Their conversation shifted from medical concerns to something deeper, something far more personal. David spoke of his fears, the constant pressure of maintaining his empire, of losing control over everything he had built. He spoke of the weight of his family's expectations, the loneliness that came with living a life built on power and manipulation. For a moment, David was just a man sharing his insecurities with the one person who had seen through his facade. In that quiet recovery room, a bond began to form. Slow, tentative, but undeniable. And for Maria, it was the beginning of a dangerous emotional trap. The man she had kept at arm's length, the man who had been nothing more than a patient, now stirred something inside her. A vulnerability, a flicker of empathy that would come to haunt her. But as much as she tried to maintain her professional distance, Maria couldn't help but feel something shift. And David, he knew exactly how to make her feel needed. He had just found a new weakness to exploit. As Maria continued her nightly routine, something had changed. David had become more open, more willing to share the things he had buried beneath layers of wealth and power. Slowly, he began to let down the walls that had once shielded him from the world. And Maria found herself listening, not just to a patient, but to a man searching for something deeper than what his life of luxury could provide. David spoke of his marriage, of the years spent living side by side with someone who, despite her beauty and outward perfection, felt distant and unapproachable. The coldness he described wasn't just physical. It was emotional. He confessed to feeling like a shadow in his own life, constantly playing a role he never chose, bound by the expectations of social status, family, and the world around him. He spoke of his loneliness, the isolation that no amount of money or success could fill. For the first time, David revealed that beneath his wealth, beneath the empire he had built, he felt trapped by the marriage, by the societal expectations, by the very life he had crafted to shield himself from the world. And in that moment, something shifted for Maria. She saw past the polished exterior, the wealth, the power. She saw a man who, despite all his success, was as human as anyone else. A man who, in his own way, was just as lonely as she was. They bonded over their shared sense of being outsiders. Maria, a foreigner in Canada, had come to this city alone with nothing but the hope of a better life for her family. She understood loneliness. Understood what it was like to feel like a stranger in a place that should feel like home. But what David had never realized was that despite his empire, he too felt like an outsider. A man who had everything, but was invisible to those who should have cared most. David looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, and in that moment, he saw a kindred spirit. They were both outsiders, living in a world that didn't fully belong to them, each carrying their own burdens and unmet needs. But for the first time, they weren't just patient and nurse. They were two people who understood the weight of isolation. Maria nodded, her gaze never leaving his. It wasn't just empathy. It was something deeper, something unspoken that connected them in a way neither had anticipated. Their bond was no longer just about her caring for him. It was about shared pain, shared dreams, and the understanding that no matter how different their lives appeared on the surface, they weren't so far apart after all. And in this fragile moment, Maria and David began to realize that the emotional trap had already been set. Neither could see it yet, but they were both already caught. David, ever the strategist, had learned something important about Maria, something he would use to his advantage. She worked every weekend, sacrificing her free time, her only chance at a life outside the penthouse. It was clear she was isolated, alone in a city that was as cold as it was vast. And David knew that. In isolation, people become more reliant on the only company available. He knew how to use that loneliness to draw her closer. He made it sound innocent, a small favor. But David knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just offering to help with her exhaustion. He was offering her something she hadn't had in a long time. An escape. A glimpse into a World of leisure, of luxury, a world she could never afford. David took her to places she'd only ever dreamed of. Places she could never afford on her own. First, the CN Tower, where they stood at the top, looking down at the world below. The city stretched out before them, vast and infinite. Maria had never seen Toronto from this height, this perspective. To her, it felt like a dream she could never have touched until David showed her the way. As they walked the harbor front next, David kept the conversation light, almost playful, sharing little tidbits about the city, the lake, the views. He invited her to enjoy the sights and sounds as though he were simply a guide, showing her a side of Toronto she had never seen. But with each new place, with each new experience, David was weaving something deeper, an emotional connection disguised as a casual outing. These walks weren't just about showing Maria a new side of Toronto. They were about creating memories, moments that felt magical, moments she would come to associate with David. He didn't need to push. All he needed was to guide her to the right places, to fill the empty spaces in her life with his presence. And in doing so, he began to create something she couldn't walk away from. A bond that felt too personal, too meaningful to discard. In those quiet moments, David was careful not to cross boundaries, at least not overtly. He knew that any direct move could send her running. Instead, he built intimacy like a slow fire, feeding it with the warmth of shared experiences, all while carefully respecting the professional line she had drawn. And just like that, David had begun weaving an emotional trap. One that even in her quietest moments, Maria couldn't escape. She had started seeing him not just as a patient, but as a man with layers she had never considered. A man who, despite his wealth and power, had opened a door to a world she never thought she could touch. And now she was starting to wonder if it was a world she could ever leave. Victoria had always been watchful, but now she was watching with purpose. From the moment Maria had entered their lives, Victoria's suspicions had deepened. She knew David's pattern, knew how he operated, how he lured people in with his charm and his wealth. But this time, something felt different. She could feel it like a shadow just beyond the reach of light. David had always been smooth, always in control. But Maria was different. Victoria knew the signs. David had a familiar pattern, one he had perfected over the years. He seduced with calculated ease, drew people into his orbit with promises of affection, and then moved on when the game no longer served him. But with Maria, it was different. She didn't respond the way the others did. There was no flirtation. No coy smiles or hidden glances. Instead, Maria gave him something rare. Genuine responses, honest reactions that didn't fit into David's usual strategy. Maria wasn't playing David's game. She wasn't caught up in the allure of his wealth or his charm. She responded to him, yes, but it wasn't the way he expected. It was as if she saw him not just as a wealthy man, but as someone needing to be understood, and that more than anything unsettled Victoria. Victoria was no stranger to jealousy. But this wasn't just about jealousy. It was about control. She knew her husband's patterns. Knew how he'd been with every woman who had come before. But with Maria, there was an unpredictability, an element that didn't fit into the script David had written for everyone in his life. And that terrified her. Victoria's surveillance was no longer just about confirming her suspicions. It had become a full-blown obsession. She couldn't afford to let this go unnoticed. Not this time. Something was happening between David and Maria. Something that went beyond the ordinary. Victoria had watched learned, and now she knew she wasn't going to let Maria take what was hers. The game had changed, and she wasn't about to let anyone, least of all, Maria, upend the world she had built. Victoria knew the importance of information. And in her relentless need to understand what was happening between David and Maria, she did what she did best. She researched. She dug deep into Maria's background, seeking any shred of information that could explain why this nurse was different. The more she learned, the more she understood the delicate web David was entangled in. Victoria quickly discovered that Maria's life in Toronto was built on sacrifice. Her family back in the Philippines was struggling. Her brother's medical needs were urgent, and Maria was the one keeping them afloat. A single mother, an aging father, and the heavy burden of a younger sibling's surgery hanging over them all. Maria was their lifeline, and she would go to any lengths to provide for them. Maria was vulnerable, not just in the emotional sense, but financially. Her family's needs were constant, a weight she carried with every paycheck she sent home. Victoria saw it now, the perfect storm. Maria wasn't just a nurse doing her job. She was a woman with nothing but her work, her family, and the promise of a better life. And David knew it. Victoria wasn't just dealing with another fleeting affair. This was something different. David's previous affairs had been physical, temporary distractions. He used them, discarded them, and moved on. But with Maria, it was emotional, and that made it existential. David was forming a connection with her, something far more dangerous than mere attraction. It wasn't just about taking what he wanted anymore. It was about feeding a need, one that could break everything he had built. This wasn't just about Maria's family or her financial desperation. This was about the emotional bond forming between her and David, one that Victoria could already see was deeper than any of the others. And that more than anything made Maria a threat. David was no longer just a man playing at control. He was becoming someone who could lose everything he had for the first time in his life. Now Victoria had a choice. She could watch from the sidelines and let David destroy himself. Or she could step in and take back what was hers. And if she had to destroy Maria to do it, so be it. Victoria wasn't just watching from a distance anymore. She was collecting evidence. Proof that David's growing connection with Maria wasn't just a passing distraction. It was something far more dangerous. And Victoria knew she needed to be prepared. She knew how to play the game, how to gather the right ammunition. And this time, the stakes were higher. David had always claimed his extravagant medical supply purchases were necessary for his recovery. But as Victoria sifted through the records, it became painfully clear these weren't medical supplies. They were gifts. Gifts meant for someone who wasn't his wife. Maria. Money flowed freely. Gifts, payments, transfers, all directed to Maria. The evidence was undeniable. But Victoria wasn't just looking for financial proof. She knew that to break David's emotional bond with Maria, she needed more. She needed everything. Victoria knew that control was built on knowledge. The more she collected, the clearer the picture became. David's affair wasn't just a betrayal. It was a threat to everything he had worked for, everything he had built. The emotional intimacy he was building with Maria wasn't just a fleeting affair. It was a challenge to Victoria's power, to her sense of control over her own life. With each piece of evidence, Victoria wasn't just preparing to confront David. She was preparing for war. She understood the stakes. Now, this wasn't just about loyalty or infidelity. It was about Power. And in a game of power, knowledge was everything. Victoria wasn't just going to let this slide. She had the proof. And with it, she would make sure that David understood who truly held the power in their marriage. The game had shifted. Now it was time to act. Victoria had always prided herself on the life she had built. Her empire, her status, her place in Toronto's elite circles. Every dress, every handbag, every luxurious accessory was a testament to her success, to the power she had carefully cultivated. But as she stood there in her walk-in closet, surrounded by the symbols of her life, something shifted. The weight of her discovery was crushing, far more than the sum of the evidence she had gathered. What Victoria found sent a chill down her spine. David had been consulting divorce lawyers, preparing for a future she hadn't seen coming. The legal notes weren't just about a quick divorce. They were about protecting assets, structuring his wealth in ways that would make it nearly impossible for her to claim anything. The timeline indicated long-term planning far beyond a temporary affair. David had been thinking about this for months, maybe even years. For years, Victoria had been in the dark. She had known David was distant, distracted at times, but she had never suspected that he was planning his escape so carefully, so methodically. This wasn't just about Maria. This was about David deciding he was ready to leave her behind. A slow, calculated exit. Nothing temporary about it. Standing among the symbols of her life, Victoria realized something deeper than betrayal. She wasn't just losing a husband. She was losing her entire identity. All the years she had spent building a perfect world around her. All the sacrifices she had made to keep up appearances. Those designer clothes, those lavish events, her seat at the table of power, none of it mattered anymore. It was all about to be torn apart, and she would be left with nothing. The game had changed. David's betrayal wasn't just an affair. It was a full-scale dismantling of everything she had worked for. And now the fight for control would begin. But this time, Victoria wasn't going to lose. David's recovery had gone better than expected, but with his increasing health issues, he found new ways to keep Maria close. He claimed ongoing complications, an excuse that seemed plausible enough, but one he could use to his advantage. The severity of his condition, always fluctuating, conveniently required constant care, and Maria, bound by her duty to her patient, had no choice but to stay on. The story was simple. David's complications weren't as minor as initially thought. And though Maria had followed her medical training to the letter, there was one person who could legitimize this new extension of her care. The doctor, David's word, and Maria's unquestioning acceptance were enough to convince him. A new prescription was written, and the doctor approved the extended private nursing arrangement. An official decision that would cover everything from her hours to the level of care David required. Maria had always kept professional boundaries intact. But now her role as his nurse had become more complicated, more personal. The lines were blurring, and she couldn't deny the growing tension between them, even if she refused to acknowledge it. David knew exactly what he was doing. His charm, always smooth, always practiced, was beginning to crack. The walls Maria had built around herself, his compliments, his gratitude, began to feel less like flattery and more like an emotional hook. She had done nothing wrong, nothing to invite this, but it was happening nonetheless. And with each passing day, Maria was becoming more intertwined in David's world. David's manipulation was subtle, but effective. He'd used his illness as a way to entrap Maria. First in the guise of professional duty and now in the silent expectation that she would continue to care for him. The extended nursing arrangement was now part of their daily lives. But what had started as a medical necessity was beginning to feel more like a carefully crafted excuse, a way for David to keep Maria close and in turn create the illusion of intimacy. The boundary between patient and caregiver had become too thin to see. David's words weren't just gratitude anymore. They were tools. Tools to make Maria feel needed, to make her feel indispensable. And as she looked at the message, she knew she was walking a dangerous line. But she couldn't help it. She wanted to believe he cared. She wanted to believe that this connection was real. But in a world where lines had already been crossed, Maria couldn't see that the emotional trap had already been set. David's care was no longer about healing. He was cultivating an emotional dependence that would soon become impossible for Maria to escape. And soon she would be the one left questioning what was real and what was manipulation. It was week 5 of Maria's extended care and the lines between patient and nurse had blurred further than she could have ever anticipated. As Maria adjusted David's medication, her hands steady, her movements mechanical, something unexpected happened. David, his eyes still tired but filled with something more, something soft, reached out gently, taking her hand in his. Thank you for seeing me, not just the money, he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. The word, sincere and heavy with meaning, hung in the air, leaving Maria stunned. For the first time in weeks, the barrier between them felt fragile, almost non-existent. David wasn't just thanking her for her care. He was thanking her for seeing him, the person beneath the wealth and the facade. Maria had built walls around her heart. Walls that David had slowly chipped away at. Tonight, those walls began to crumble. His words, his touch, were the first cracks. Small, subtle, but enough to leave her questioning everything she had worked so hard to protect. She had always kept her distance. But now she wasn't sure she could anymore. David, ever the strategist, had taken his manipulation to a new level. Unbeknownst to Maria, he had rented a secret apartment in the entertainment district, a space meant for private recovery sessions. It was beautiful, designed with her comfort in mind. Each detail carefully curated to make her feel at ease. The subtle luxury of the space was enough to draw her in, to make her feel like she was part of something more. What Maria didn't know was that this apartment wasn't just for recovery. It was part of David's game. Hidden cameras had been placed strategically throughout the space, capturing every interaction between them. Every moment, every look was recorded, catalogued, and watched. Maria was playing a role she hadn't agreed to, and she had no idea just how deep David's control reached. David's manipulation wasn't just emotional, it was financial. He knew Maria's family was struggling, that every dollar she earned was sent home with hopes of a better life. So, he offered her something she couldn't ignore. A monthly medical consulting fee of $8,000, triple what she earned at the hospital. The money, too much to refuse, was a hook, a way to make her feel indebted to him. Along with the money came the gifts, expensive extravagant tokens of gratitude. Jewelry, designer bags, vacation packages, all wrapped up in the guise of thank yous for her hard work. They were given freely without expectation, so it seemed. But in reality, they were the perfect way to create a sense of obligation, a way to make Maria feel like she owed him. And then came the offer that Maria couldn't refuse. David promised to pay for her brother's surgery to relieve her of that burden that had weighed on her since the day she arrived in Canada. The gesture seemed kind, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Still, the offer was too good to turn down. Her brother's surgery was urgent, and David was giving her the means to make it happen. David wasn't just buying her care, he was buying her loyalty. And Maria unknowingly was walking further into his trap with each passing day. The money, the gifts, the promises, everything was part of the game. And David was playing it masterfully. Maria had become more than just a nurse to David. She had become an investment. And the cost of her loyalty was now too high to walk away from. David didn't just seduce Maria's body. He colonized her dreams. He knew exactly what to say, what to promise. And in doing so, he created a world that was impossible for her to resist. Each word, each carefully crafted sentence, built the illusion of a future that seemed so real, so attainable that Maria began to believe in it. David's words were carefully chosen, designed to make Maria feel not just wanted, but essential to his plans. He spoke of a future together, one where they would live in Oakville, in a house that was theirs, a life that would be theirs alone. He promised her that he would bring her family to Canada, that she would never have to worry about money again. David's promises were more than just words. They were a lifeline, one that Maria, in her desperation, began to believe. She had never known this kind of attention, this kind of affirmation. The life she had dreamed of, a life for her family, now seemed within her grasp. Maria's soul was torn in two. She prayed, hoping for a sign, any sign that what she was doing wasn't wrong. Catholic guilt weighed heavily on her conscience. She had always been taught that infidelity, even in its emotional form, was a sin. The affair, the promises, the growing feelings for David. Everything felt like a betrayal. Not just of her vows as a nurse, but of her faith. Maria was desperate for the promises to be real, for the future David painted to be her reality. She yearned for escape from her isolation, from the quiet desperation that had marked her days in Toronto. But the more David promised, the harder it became to walk away from him. The lines between right and wrong began to blur. David had moved seamlessly from manipulation to fantasy. "We'll have a beautiful wedding," he said. "I've been thinking about it. Maybe we'll go to Oakville for the ceremony. A quiet place. For just us." He showed her engagement rings, their sparkling diamonds, a metaphor for the life he promised her. Maria could almost see it. The dress, the flowers, the ring on her finger. She could almost feel it. Her new life. The one David had promised. The idea of a wedding, of a life with David, began to take root in Maria's heart. Every shopping trip for engagement rings, every conversation about venues made the fairy tale feel more and more real. David had already created a timeline, a plan for leaving Victoria, for making Maria his. And with each passing day, Maria began to believe in the dream. The dream of a happy ending that seemed just within reach. Maria had no one to turn to. Her Filipino nurse friends couldn't understand the complexities of her situation. The shame of the affair, the guilt she carried kept her silent. She couldn't share her fears, her doubts. There was no one who would understand. Her family was far away, unable to offer the support she so desperately needed. And so David became her entire emotional world. The person she leaned on, the one she turned to for comfort and direction. David had created a world where Maria felt seen, valued. He had become her emotional anchor. But as her dependence grew, so did her vulnerability. She was no longer just financially reliant on him. She had given him access to her heart, her soul. And in doing so, she had walked further into the love trap he had set for her. Maria had fallen into David's world. And the deeper she went, the harder it would be to escape. The love trap had already been set. And now, she was caught. July 18, 2020. Victoria had seen enough. The footage she had carefully collected had revealed the final betrayal. David giving Maria a diamond necklace worth $15,000. The moment was innocent, but the words that followed made Victoria's blood run cold. David had already promised Maria everything. The life she had dreamed of. He had already begun planning their future together, and Victoria, the woman who had built everything with him, was nothing more than a bystander. The words were a knife to her heart. Maria had won. And Victoria knew in that moment the war was over. Victoria's world crumbled further when she uncovered David's divorce petition. A petition that if filed would leave her with minimal assets, barely enough to sustain the life she had known. The asset protection strategy outlined in the papers was designed to ensure that David kept every penny, every possession, while leaving Victoria with nothing. She wasn't just being discarded. She was being erased. David had orchestrated his exit with the precision of a surgeon. He had already planned when to file, when to cut ties, and how to protect himself. The woman who had stood by him for years was about to be tossed aside like an afterthought. In Toronto's elite circles, being publicly discarded wasn't just humiliation. It was obliteration. Victoria's name, her status, everything she had built would be reduced to nothing if David left her. The shame of a public divorce, the gossip, the whispers. There was no coming back from it. If she allowed this to happen, she would never be the woman she had been. She would become invisible. Victoria knew that to truly destroy Maria, she needed to act with precision. She wasn't just planning an affair's end. She was planning the complete erasure of Maria's future. And in her research, she found the perfect weapon. David's post-surgical medications, specifically the opioid fentanyl, provided the means. A digital forensics expert reviewing the original surveillance footage discovered something crucial. Evidence of sophisticated editing. The footage had been manipulated, tampered with to create a false narrative. The truth about the manipulated evidence began to emerge as the whistleblower from Victoria's security company came forward with damning information. The video footage had been altered to frame Maria. Every piece of evidence twisted to ensure her conviction. Victoria, the mastermind behind the manipulation, had covered her tracks carefully. But now, the truth was coming to light. Victoria had anticipated this. Once the truth began to surface, she liquidated her assets and moved them offshore. Before any charges could be filed against her, she disappeared, vanishing into a non-extradition country. Her wealth and power protecting her from any consequences. She was free, at least for now. Maria was deported to the Philippines. Her life forever altered. Her nursing license was permanently revoked and her family's hopes were crushed. Her brother, who had needed the surgery, had died before the funds ever reached him. Her parents, aging and frail, now had to face the harsh realities of their lives without the support they had counted on. Maria returned home broken, unable to heal others or even herself. 3 lives shattered by a woman's refusal to be discarded. Maria's innocence had been stolen and her world turned upside down. But the cost of Victoria's vengeance had been far greater than anyone could have imagined. 3 lives destroyed by one woman's refusal to be discarded. The pursuit of power and control had come at a devastating cost, leaving behind only destruction and loss. In the game of power and privilege, the innocent rarely survive intact. Maria's story is one of manipulation, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of a system stacked against the vulnerable. If the story moved you, please subscribe and share. Justice delayed isn't always justice denied, but sometimes the damage is already done. What would you have done in Maria's position? Let us know in the comments below.